In the shadowed halls of Ravenshollow Manor, where portraits of long-dead ancestors gazed down with disapproving eyes, a marriage of convenience had become something far more dangerous. Duke Alexander Blackwood had finally claimed what was rightfully his untouched wife of 3 years. But as dawn broke over the Yorkshire moors in 1847, he would discover that some secrets are worth more than empires, and others can destroy them entirely. What Lady Evangeline had hidden beneath her mask of dutiful submission would shake the very foundations of one of England's most powerful dukedoms. If you're listening to this story, don't forget to click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments which part of the world you're listening from. I want to know how far this story has traveled. The morning mist clung to the ancient stones of Ravenshollow Manor, like the whispered secrets that had haunted its halls for generations. Lady Evangeline Blackwood stood at the towering window of her private chambers, her delicate fingers tracing patterns on the frost-kissed glass as she watched the Yorkshire countryside emerge from its nightly shroud. 3 years, 3 long years since she had walked down the aisle of St. Margaret's Cathedral in London, her ivory silk train trailing behind her like the remnants of her former life. She was 22 now, no longer the trembling 19-year-old who had been bartered away to secure her father's failing estates. The Earl of Pemberton had been drowning in debt, his gambling habits having consumed the family fortune with the voracious appetite of a starving beast. The Duke of Ravenshollow's offer had been a lifeline, a marriage alliance that would restore the Pemberton name while providing the Duke with a wife of impeccable breeding and untarnished reputation. A perfect arrangement, her father had declared, his bloodshot eyes gleaming with relief as he signed away his daughter's future. The Duke requires a wife to secure his lineage, and you, my dear Evangeline, require a husband to secure your position in society. But Alexander Blackwood, the 7th Duke of Ravenshollow, had proven to be a husband in name only. Tall and imposing, with coal-black hair and eyes the color of winter storms, he commanded respect wherever he walked. His presence filled every room he entered. His voice carried the authority of centuries of noble breeding, and his wealth was legendary throughout England. Yet for 3 years he had maintained a careful distance from his young wife, treating her with the same polite courtesy he might show a favored guest. Their wedding night had been a study in restraint. He had escorted her to her chambers, bowed formally, and wished her pleasant dreams before retiring to his own wing of the vast manor. "When you are ready, my lady," he had said, his voice gentle but distant, "we shall discuss the future of our union." That future, it seemed, had been perpetually postponed. Evangeline had initially felt relief at his consideration, but as months turned to years, that relief had transformed into something more complex, a mixture of gratitude, confusion, and an unexpected longing she dared not name. She had grown from a frightened girl into a woman within the gilded cage of Ravenshollow, educated by the finest tutors, dressed in the most exquisite gowns, and treated with the deference due to a duchess. Yet she remained untouched, unclaimed, existing in a strange limbo between maiden and wife. The Duke's daily routine was as predictable as the sunrise. He would rise before dawn to review estate matters in his study, take breakfast alone while reading correspondence from London, spend his mornings riding across his vast holdings, and his afternoons in meetings with his steward, tenants, or visiting dignitaries. Evenings were reserved for reading in his library or attending to political matters that required his attention as a member of the House of Lords. Evangeline's own days were filled with the expected pursuits of a duchess, overseeing the household staff, managing charitable endeavours in the nearby village of Ravenshollow, maintaining correspondence with other ladies of quality, and pursuing her passion for botanical illustration. She had transformed the manor's conservatory into her personal sanctuary, filled with exotic plants and flowers that she studied and painted with meticulous detail. Their interactions were cordial, even warm at times. He would inquire about her health and happiness during their formal dinners, compliment her on the improvements she had made to the manor's gardens, and occasionally join her for tea when his schedule permitted. But always, always, there remained an invisible barrier between them, a careful distance that neither seemed willing or able to cross. The servants whispered, "Of course." Mrs. Hartwell, the housekeeper, would purse her lips disapprovingly when she thought no one was looking. The younger maids would exchange meaningful glances when they changed the linens in the Duke's chambers, noting that the Duchess's rooms remained perpetually separate. Even Thomas, the elderly butler who had served the Blackwood family for 40 years, seemed to carry an air of concerned bewilderment about the unusual arrangement. "His Grace is a gentleman of the highest order," Mrs. Hartwell had once confided to Evangeline during a discussion about household matters. "But even gentlemen must attend to their duties, if you'll pardon my saying so, Your Grace." Evangeline had merely smiled and redirected the conversation to the upcoming harvest festival, but the housekeeper's words had lingered in her mind like an uncomfortable truth. She was a duchess without truly being a wife, a woman suspended between two worlds with no clear path forward. The isolation of Ravenshollow Manor only intensified her sense of displacement. Located in the remote Yorkshire Dales, the estate was magnificent but lonely, surrounded by rolling hills and ancient forests that seemed to stretch endlessly toward the horizon. The nearest neighbour of consequence was Lord Pembroke, whose estate lay a full day's ride to the south, and visits to London were infrequent affairs reserved for the social season or matters of urgent political importance. During the long winter evenings, when the wind howled across the moors and rattled the diamond-paned windows, Evangeline would often find herself wondering what her life might have been if circumstances had been different. Would she have married for love, as her romantic heart had once dreamed? Would she have found happiness in a modest cottage with a man who saw her as more than a beautiful ornament to grace his ancestral home? But such thoughts were dangerous luxuries, and she had learned to push them aside in favor of more practical considerations. She was the Duchess of Ravenshollow, mistress of one of England's greatest estates, and she had responsibilities that extended far beyond her own personal happiness. The tenants depended on her charitable works, the household staff looked to her for guidance, and the Blackwood name required her to maintain the highest standards of conduct and dignity. As autumn gave way to winter in this third year of their marriage, Evangeline had begun to sense a change in her husband's demeanour. He watched her more intently during their shared meals, his storm-grey eyes following her movements with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. Their conversations had grown longer, more personal, touching on subjects beyond the mundane details of estate management and social obligations. Just last week, he had surprised her by appearing in the conservatory while she was working on a particularly challenging illustration of a rare orchid. "You have remarkable talent," he had said, studying her work with genuine appreciation. "Perhaps you might consider having your illustrations published. I have connections in London who would be honored to review your portfolio." The suggestion had been both thrilling and terrifying. To have her work published would be a dream realized, but it would also mean stepping beyond the safe confines of Ravenshollow into a world where she would be judged on her own merits rather than her title. I had not considered such a possibility," she had stammered, suddenly aware of how close he was standing, the subtle scent of sandalwood and leather that always seemed to surround him. "Consider it now," he had replied, his voice carrying a warmth she had rarely heard before. "You have gifts that deserve to be shared with the world, Evangeline." It was the first time he had used her given name in months, and the sound of it on his lips had sent an unexpected shiver through her entire being. Now, as she stood at her window watching the December morning unfold, Evangeline found herself wondering if the careful equilibrium of their marriage was finally beginning to shift. The thought both excited and terrified her in equal measure. What would happen when the Duke finally decided to claim what was rightfully his? The grand ballroom of Ravenshollow Manor had been transformed into a winter wonderland for the annual Christmas Eve celebration, a tradition that had endured for over 2 centuries. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across walls adorned with garlands of holly and ivy, while the massive fireplace crackled with warmth that seemed to embrace the assembled guests like a lover's caress. The cream of Yorkshire society had gathered beneath the vaulted ceilings, their jewels glittering like captured starlight as they moved through the elaborate quadrilles and country dances that marked the season. Evangeline stood at the top of the grand staircase, her emerald silk gown flowing around her like liquid jade, the blackwood emeralds at her throat catching the light with every breath. She had spent hours preparing for this evening, knowing that it would be the most significant social event Ravenshollow had hosted during her tenure as Duchess. More importantly, Alexander had specifically requested that she serve as his hostess in the fullest sense, not merely greeting guests and overseeing arrangements, but standing beside him as his true partner for the first time in their 3-year marriage. "You look radiant, my dear," he had said when he came to escort her downstairs, his eyes holding a warmth that made her heart flutter like a caged bird. He was magnificent in his formal evening wear, the black tailcoat emphasizing his broad shoulders, while the white silk waistcoat and perfectly tied cravat spoke of understated elegance. The Blackwood signet ring gleamed on his finger, and the family's ancient ceremonial sword hung at his side, a reminder of the noble lineage he represented. "Thank you, Your Grace," she had replied, accepting his offered arm with trembling fingers. "I hope the evening meets with your approval. I have no doubt it will exceed all expectations," he had murmured, covering her gloved hand with his own. "Tonight marks a new beginning for us, Evangeline. I hope you understand the significance of that." His words had sent a thrill of anticipation through her entire being. After 3 years of careful distance, was he finally ready to make their marriage real in every sense? The possibility both thrilled and terrified her, but she had nodded gracefully, allowing him to lead her into their new future. The evening had begun perfectly. Lord and Lady Pembroke arrived first, followed by the Earl of Whitmore and his vivacious daughter Charlotte, whose golden curls and sapphire eyes had made her the toast of London's last social season. Sir Reginald Ashworth, a prominent member of Parliament and long-time friend of the Duke, came with his wife and eldest son. The local gentry filled out the guest list, prosperous landowners, successful merchants who had earned their way into polite society, and several military officers home on leave from their postings abroad. Evangeline had moved through the receiving line with practiced grace, greeting each guest with the perfect combination of warmth and dignity that her position required. She had overseen the elaborate dinner service, ensuring that the finest china, crystal, and silver graced the mahogany table that could seat 40 with ease. The menu had been carefully planned to showcase both traditional English fare and exotic delicacies that spoke to the Duke's sophisticated palate. Roasted goose with chestnut stuffing, venison from the estate's own deer park, delicate fish courses prepared with French techniques, and an array of sweets that would have impressed the royal court itself. Throughout the meal, Alexander had been attentive in ways that set tongues wagging among the assembled guests. He had helped her to choice morsels, refilled her wineglass personally rather than leaving the task to servants, and engaged her in conversation that demonstrated his respect for her opinions on matters ranging from literature to politics. When Lady Pembroke commented on the unusual harmony between the Duke and Duchess, Alexander had smiled and raised his glass in a toast. "To my remarkable wife," he had declared, his voice carrying clearly through the dining room, "whose grace and intelligence have transformed Ravenshollow into a true home. May this Christmas mark the beginning of many years of happiness together." The assembled guests had raised their glasses with enthusiasm, and Evangeline had felt her cheeks flush with pleasure at the public acknowledgement of their partnership. For the first time since their wedding day, she had felt truly married, truly valued, as more than a decorative addition to the Blackwood legacy. After dinner, the company had retired to the ballroom for dancing and entertainment. A small orchestra had been engaged from York, and their music filled the vast space with melodies that seemed to capture the magic of the season. Alexander had claimed the first dance, leading her onto the polished floor with a confidence that made her feel as though she were floating on air. "You have outdone yourself tonight," he had murmured, as they moved through the steps of a waltz, his hand warm and strong at her waist. "Every detail is perfect, from the decorations to the menu to your own radiant beauty." "I wanted everything to be special," she had replied, losing herself in the storm-grey depths of his eyes. "This felt like an important evening for us." "More important than you know," he had agreed, spinning her gracefully before drawing her close again. "There are matters we must discuss, Evangeline, private matters that have been too long delayed." The promise in his voice had made her pulse race, and she had found herself imagining what those private discussions might entail. Would he finally come to her chambers tonight? Would their marriage bed finally be blessed with the intimacy that had been so carefully avoided? The thought both thrilled and terrified her, but she had nodded her agreement, trusting in his gentle strength to guide them both through whatever lay ahead. The evening had continued in a haze of music, laughter, and champagne. Evangeline had danced with several of the gentlemen present, always returning to Alexander's side between sets. She had noticed Charlotte Ashworth watching them with an expression that seemed oddly calculating, but she had dismissed the observation as mere fancy. Charlotte was known for her ambitious nature and her determination to make an advantageous marriage, but surely she would not set her sights on a man who was already wed. It was nearly midnight when the evening took its devastating turn. The orchestra had just finished a lively country dance, and the guests were gathering around the massive Christmas tree that dominated one corner of the ballroom. Alexander had stepped away momentarily to speak with Sir Reginald about some matter of parliamentary business, leaving Evangeline to oversee the traditional gift exchange that marked the culmination of the celebration. She was arranging the beautifully wrapped packages beneath the tree when she heard Charlotte's voice, pitched just loud enough to carry to the nearby guests, but soft enough to seem like a private confidence. "Poor dear Evangeline," Charlotte was saying to Lady Pembroke, her tone dripping with false sympathy. "She tries so hard to play the perfect Duchess, but everyone knows the truth about her marriage, don't they?" Evangeline's hands stilled on the packages, her blood turning to ice in her veins. Around her, she could sense the subtle shift in attention as other guests began to listen to Charlotte's words. "Whatever do you mean, my dear?" Lady Pembroke asked, though her tone suggested she was eager to hear whatever gossip Charlotte was prepared to share. "Well, it's hardly a secret that the Duke has never truly claimed her as his wife," Charlotte continued, her voice carrying a cruel satisfaction. 3 years of marriage, and still she remains as untouched as the day she walked down the aisle. One has to wonder why a man would keep such a beautiful woman at arm's length unless there was something lacking in her character. The words hit Evangeline like physical blows, each syllable designed to wound and humiliate. She could feel the eyes of the assembled guests turning toward her, could sense the whispered conversations beginning to spread through the ballroom like wildfire. Her carefully constructed world was crumbling around her, and she was powerless to stop it. "Perhaps," Charlotte continued, her voice growing bolder as she sensed her audience's rapt attention, "the Duke has finally realized that a marriage based solely on financial necessity can never truly satisfy a man of his appetites. After all, what use is a wife who cannot fulfill her most basic duties?" The implication was clear, and Evangeline felt her face burn with shame and humiliation. She wanted to flee, to escape the curious stares and barely concealed smirks of the guests who had moments before been celebrating her apparent happiness. But her feet seemed rooted to the spot, her body frozen by the magnitude of her public disgrace. It was then that Alexander's voice cut through the murmur of conversation like a blade through silk. "Miss Ashworth," he said, his tone carrying a deadly quiet that made every person in the ballroom fall silent. "I believe you have something to say about my wife." Charlotte turned toward him with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, clearly believing she had his support in her cruel assessment. "Your Grace, I was merely observing that you were merely demonstrating the depths of your own vulgarity and ignorance," Alexander interrupted, his voice carrying clearly through the now silent ballroom. "My wife is a lady of impeccable character and breeding, qualities that are apparently foreign to your understanding." But instead of the defense Evangeline had hoped for, Alexander's next words delivered a blow more devastating than anything Charlotte could have devised. "However," he continued, his gaze moving to Evangeline with an expression she couldn't quite read, "Miss Ashworth is not entirely incorrect in her observations. My wife and I have indeed maintained separate arrangements during our marriage, though the reasons are far more complex than her simple mind could comprehend." The ballroom seemed to spin around Evangeline as the full weight of his words sank in. He was confirming Charlotte's accusations, validating every cruel implication in front of the assembled cream of Yorkshire society. The man she had begun to trust, to hope for, to perhaps even love, was publicly acknowledging that their marriage was indeed the hollow shell that Charlotte had described. "The truth is," Alexander continued, his voice carrying a strange note of finality, "that I have been waiting for my wife to demonstrate that she is worthy of the full privileges of her position. Tonight, I had hoped to make an announcement that would put all speculation to rest. However, recent events have made it clear that such an announcement would be premature." Evangeline felt the world tilt beneath her feet. What recent events? What had she done to disappoint him so thoroughly that he would humiliate her in front of their guests? She searched his face for some sign of the warmth she had seen there earlier in the evening, but found only cold assessment and what looked disturbingly like disappointment. "Therefore," Alexander announced, his words falling like hammer blows on her already shattered heart, "I believe it would be best if the Duchess and I continued our current arrangements for the foreseeable future. Some unions, it seems, are destined to remain matters of convenience rather than affection." The silence that followed was deafening. Evangeline could feel the weight of every gaze in the room, could sense the mixture of pity, curiosity, and barely concealed satisfaction that radiated from the assembled guests. Charlotte's smile had become triumphant, while Lady Pembroke looked as though she had just witnessed the most delicious scandal of the decade. Unable to bear another moment of the crushing humiliation, Evangeline gathered what remained of her dignity and moved toward the ballroom doors. Her legs felt unsteady beneath her, and she was grateful for the years of deportment training that allowed her to maintain her composure even as her world collapsed around her. "If you will excuse me," she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying clearly in the oppressive silence, "I find myself quite fatigued. Please continue to enjoy the evening." She made it to the doors before her composure finally cracked, and she could hear the explosion of whispered conversation that erupted behind her as she fled toward the sanctuary of her chambers. Behind her, the Christmas celebration continued, but for Evangeline, the season of joy had become a nightmare of public shame and private anguish. As she reached the safety of her rooms, one question burned in her mind above all others. What had she done to deserve such cruel treatment from the man she had begun to trust with her heart? The first light of dawn crept through the frost-covered windows of Evangeline's chambers like an unwelcome intruder, illuminating the evidence of her sleepless night. Her emerald gown lay crumpled on the floor where she had torn it off in her anguish, the blackwood emeralds scattered across her dressing table like fallen tears. She sat curled in the window seat, still wearing only her chemise and wrapper, her dark hair hanging loose around her shoulders as she stared out at the Yorkshire moors with eyes swollen from weeping. The events of the previous evening played through her mind in an endless, torturous loop. Alexander's cold words, Charlotte's triumphant smile, the pitying stares of the assembled guests. Each memory was a fresh wound that refused to heal. She had been so foolish to believe that their marriage might finally become something real, something meaningful. The careful distance he had maintained for 3 years had not been consideration for her youth and inexperience, as she had believed, but rather a reflection of his true feelings about their union. A soft knock at her door interrupted her brooding, followed by the gentle voice of her lady's maid, Sarah. "Your Grace? I've brought your morning chocolate and some correspondence that arrived with the early post." Evangeline wanted nothing more than to send Sarah away, to remain hidden in her chambers until the shame of last night's humiliation faded from memory. But duty called, even in her darkest hour. She was still the Duchess of Ravenshollow, regardless of her husband's public dismissal of their marriage. "Come in, Sarah," she called, her voice hoarse from the tears she had shed. Sarah entered with a worried expression, carrying a silver tray laden with chocolate, toast, and a small stack of letters. The young woman had served as Evangeline's maid since her arrival at Ravenshollow, and her loyalty had never wavered, despite the unusual circumstances of the ducal marriage. "Your Grace," Sarah said softly, setting the tray on a nearby table, "I hope you don't mind my saying, but the staff is quite concerned about you. Mrs. Hartwell sent word that you're not to worry about household matters today. She'll see to everything." The kindness in Sarah's voice nearly brought fresh tears to Evangeline's eyes. Even the servants, it seemed, understood the magnitude of her humiliation better than her own husband. "Thank you, Sarah," Evangeline managed, accepting the cup of chocolate with trembling hands. "I'm afraid I'm not quite myself this morning." "Of course not, Your Grace. Anyone would be upset after—" Sarah trailed off, clearly uncertain how to reference the previous evening's events. "After being publicly humiliated by my own husband?" Evangeline finished bitterly. "Yes, I suppose anyone would be upset by such treatment." Sarah's eyes filled with sympathy, but she wisely chose not to comment further on the Duke's behavior. Instead, she gestured toward the letters on the tray. "Perhaps the correspondence might provide some distraction, Your Grace. There's a letter from London that bears the seal of Lady Agatha Pemberton." Evangeline's heart lifted slightly at the mention of her great-aunt's name. Lady Agatha was her father's aunt, a formidable woman in her 60s who had never married and had spent her life traveling the world and pursuing intellectual interests that scandalized polite society. She maintained a fashionable townhouse in Bloomsbury and was known for hosting salons where writers, artists, and progressive thinkers gathered to discuss everything from women's rights to scientific discoveries. With shaking fingers, Evangeline broke the wax seal and unfolded the letter, written in Agatha's bold, confident hand. "My dearest Evangeline, I hope this letter finds you well and thriving in your role as Duchess. I have been thinking of you often during my recent travels through Italy, where I have been studying the remarkable botanical illustrations in the Vatican's private collections. The work reminded me of your own considerable talents in that area, and I find myself wondering if you have continued to pursue your artistic interests. I am writing to extend an invitation that I hope you will consider seriously. I am planning to host a series of winter salons in London, focusing on the intersection of art and science. Several prominent botanists and natural philosophers will be in attendance, including Dr. Elias Reed, whose groundbreaking work on plant classification has revolutionized the field. I believe your illustrations would be of great interest to such an audience, and I would be honored to have you stay with me in Bloomsbury for the season. I know that your position as Duchess comes with many obligations, but I also believe that a woman of your intelligence and talent deserves opportunities to shine in her own right, rather than merely reflecting the glory of her husband's title. Please consider my invitation carefully, my dear. Sometimes a change of scenery can provide clarity that familiar surroundings cannot. Your devoted aunt, Agatha P.S. I have taken the liberty of mentioning your work to Dr. Reed, who expressed considerable interest in seeing your botanical studies. He will be attending my salon on January 15th, should you decide to join us." Evangeline read the letter twice, her heart racing with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. The invitation represented everything she had never dared to dream of: recognition for her own talents, intellectual stimulation, and most importantly, escape from the suffocating atmosphere of Ravenshollow Manor. "Good news, Your Grace?" Sarah asked, noting the change in her mistress's expression. "Perhaps," Evangeline replied slowly. "Sarah, what do you know of Dr. Elias Reed?" Sarah's eyes brightened with interest. "Oh, he's quite famous, Your Grace. My brother works for a bookseller in York, and he says Dr. Reed's books on botany are all the rage among the educated classes. They say he's a brilliant man, though some consider his ideas rather progressive." "Progressive in what way?" "Well," Sarah lowered her voice conspiratorially, "he believes that women are just as capable as men when it comes to scientific study. He's even advocated for allowing women to attend university lectures, which has caused quite a stir in academic circles." The information sent a thrill through Evangeline's entire being. A man who believed in women's intellectual capabilities. How different that would be from the world she currently inhabited, where her artistic talents were seen as charming accomplishments rather than serious pursuits. She spent the remainder of the morning composing a careful reply to her aunt, accepting the invitation while maintaining the diplomatic language appropriate to her position. She would need Alexander's permission to travel to London, of course, but given his apparent indifference to her presence, she doubted he would object to her absence. The opportunity to speak with her husband came sooner than expected. As she was sealing her letter to Agatha, a knock came at her door, followed by the Duke's voice requesting entry. Evangeline's pulse quickened with a mixture of anger and apprehension, but she granted him permission to enter. Alexander stepped into her sitting room, looking haggard and disheveled, his usually immaculate appearance marred by wrinkled clothing and bloodshot eyes that suggested he had spent the night drinking rather than sleeping. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of the previous evening's events hanging between them like a physical barrier. "Evangeline," he began, his voice rough with exhaustion, "we need to discuss what happened last night." "Indeed we do," she replied, rising from her chair with as much dignity as she could muster, "though I'm not certain what explanation you could possibly offer for your behavior." He ran a hand through his disheveled hair, a gesture that spoke of deep frustration. "You don't understand the complexities of the situation. There are matters at play that you cannot possibly comprehend." "Then enlighten me," she challenged, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Explain to me why you chose to humiliate me in front of our guests. Tell me what I have done to earn such treatment from my own husband." Alexander's jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he might actually provide the answers she desperately needed. Instead, he turned away from her, moving to stare out the window at the frost-covered gardens. "Some things are better left unexplained," he said finally. "What matters now is how we proceed from here." "How we proceed?" Evangeline's voice rose with indignation. "You have made it abundantly clear that there is no we in this marriage. You have publicly declared that I am unworthy of your full regard, that our union will remain one of convenience only." "That is not what I said," Alexander protested, turning back to face her. "It is exactly what you said," she countered, her dark eyes flashing with anger. "And it is exactly what you meant. Well, Your Grace, if that is your decision, then I have one of my own to make." She moved to her writing desk and retrieved the letter she had just finished composing. "I have received an invitation from my great-aunt to spend the winter season in London. I intend to accept." Alexander's expression darkened as he read the implications of her words. "You wish to leave Ravenshollow?" "I wish to remove myself from a situation that has become intolerable," she replied with quiet dignity. "Surely you cannot object to my absence, given your apparent indifference to my presence." For a long moment he studied her face, and she thought she saw something that might have been regret flicker in his storm-grey eyes. But when he spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "If that is your wish, then I will not prevent you from going. Perhaps some time apart will provide us both with the clarity we need." The ease with which he granted her request was like a dagger to her heart. She had hoped, despite everything, that he might ask her to stay, might finally explain the mysterious forces that seemed to drive his behavior. Instead, he was releasing her as readily as one might dismiss an unwanted servant. "Very well," she managed, her voice steady despite the pain that threatened to overwhelm her. "I shall make arrangements to depart within the week." Alexander nodded curtly and moved toward the door, but paused with his hand on the handle. "Evangeline," he said, without turning around, "I hope you find what you're looking for in London." After he left, Evangeline sank into her chair, emotionally drained by the encounter. But beneath the pain and confusion, she felt something else beginning to stir, a sense of anticipation for the new world that awaited her. For the first time in 3 years, she would have the opportunity to discover who she truly was beyond the role of Duchess, to explore her talents and interests without the suffocating weight of others' expectations. The week that followed passed in a blur of preparations. Sarah proved invaluable in helping her select appropriate clothing for London society, while Mrs. Hartwell ensured that all the household arrangements were in order for her absence. The other servants treated her with a gentle kindness that suggested they understood she was fleeing rather than simply traveling, and their sympathy only strengthened her resolve to make a new life for herself. Alexander maintained his distance throughout her preparations, though she occasionally caught glimpses of him, watching her from across the dining room or through the windows as she walked in the gardens. His expression was unreadable, but she thought she detected a sadness in his demeanor that matched her own. On the morning of her departure, as the carriage waited in the circular drive to take her to the railway station, Alexander appeared to bid her farewell. He was formally dressed and perfectly composed, every inch the duke he had been born to be. "I trust your journey will be comfortable," he said, offering her his hand to assist her into the carriage. "Thank you," she replied, accepting his help while avoiding his eyes. "I'm not certain when I shall return. Take all the time you need," he said quietly. "Ravenshollow will be here when you're ready." As the carriage pulled away from the manor, Evangeline allowed herself one last look at the imposing stone facade that had been her home for 3 years. Alexander stood on the steps, watching her departure, a solitary figure against the grey Yorkshire sky. For a moment, her resolve wavered, and she almost called out to the driver to stop. But then she remembered the humiliation of Christmas Eve, the cold dismissal in his voice, and the years of careful distance that had defined their marriage. Whatever secrets Alexander harbored, whatever reasons he had for his behavior, he had chosen not to share them with her. She could not continue to live in the shadow of his indifference, waiting for a love that might never come. The train journey to London took most of the day, and Evangeline spent the hours watching the countryside roll past, while contemplating the uncertain future that lay ahead. She was 22 years old, beautiful, intelligent, and for the first time in her adult life free to make her own choices. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. Lady Agatha's townhouse in Bloomsbury was a revelation, a 3-story Georgian building filled with books, artwork, and exotic artifacts from her travels around the world. The older woman greeted Evangeline with genuine warmth and immediately set about making her feel welcome in her new temporary home. "My dear girl," Agatha said, as they took tea in her comfortable sitting room, "you look positively piqued. I trust the journey wasn't too taxing." "The journey was fine," Evangeline replied carefully. "I'm simply grateful for your hospitality, Aunt Agatha." Agatha's sharp blue eyes studied her great niece with the perception of a woman who had spent decades observing human nature. Well, whatever has driven you from that drafty pile in Yorkshire, I'm delighted to have you here. London will do you a world of good, mark my words." Over the following days, Evangeline began to discover a world she had never imagined possible. Agatha's circle of friends included writers, artists, scientists, and social reformers, men and women who engaged in passionate debates about literature, politics, and the great questions of the age. For the first time in her life, Evangeline found herself in conversations where her opinions were not only welcomed, but actively sought. It was at one of these gatherings that she first encountered Dr. Elias Reid, and the meeting would prove to be more significant than she could have possibly imagined. What new possibilities would this brilliant, progressive man bring into her carefully ordered world? The evening of January 15th arrived with a crisp clarity that seemed to mirror Evangeline's newfound sense of purpose. Lady Agatha's salon was to be the most ambitious yet, bringing together some of London's most brilliant minds to discuss the revolutionary intersection of art and scientific discovery. Evangeline had spent weeks preparing for this moment, carefully selecting her finest botanical illustrations and binding them in a leather portfolio that now rested on her dressing table like a promise of possibilities. "You look absolutely radiant, my dear," Agatha declared as she swept into Evangeline's chambers, resplendent in deep purple silk that complemented her silver hair. "That shade of midnight blue is perfection on you, and I do believe London society has already begun to work its magic." Indeed, the past 3 weeks had transformed Evangeline in ways she was only beginning to understand. The constant intellectual stimulation, the freedom to express her thoughts without fear of judgment, and the gradual realization that her mind was every bit as sharp as those around her had restored a confidence she hadn't possessed since her wedding day. The hollow-eyed woman who had fled Yorkshire was being replaced by someone stronger, more self-assured, and infinitely more interesting. "I confess I'm nervous about tonight," Evangeline admitted, smoothing the silk of her gown with trembling fingers. "What if my work isn't as accomplished as I believed? What if I've been living in a provincial bubble, thinking myself talented when I'm merely adequate?" Agatha crossed the room and took her great-niece's hands in her own weathered but still elegant ones. "My dear girl, I have seen your work, and I can assure you that it rivals anything being produced in the finest studios of Europe. More importantly, you have something that many artists lack, a genuine passion for your subject that shines through every brushstroke. Dr. Reid will be impressed, mark my words." The mention of Dr. Elias Reid sent a familiar flutter through Evangeline's chest. She had heard so much about the renowned botanist over the past weeks. His groundbreaking research, his progressive views on women's education, his reputation as a man who valued intellect over social standing. Tonight would be their first meeting, and she found herself both eager and apprehensive about the encounter. The salon was already in full swing when they descended to Agatha's drawing room, which had been transformed into an elegant gathering space filled with the soft glow of gas lamps and the animated conversation of London's intellectual elite. Evangeline recognized several faces from previous gatherings. Mrs. Elizabeth Garrett, one of the first women to qualify as a physician in England, Mr. Charles Babbage, the brilliant mathematician and inventor, and Lady Byron, whose own intellectual pursuits had made her a formidable figure in scientific circles. "Evangeline, my dear," Agatha said, guiding her through the assembled guests, "there are several people I'm particularly eager for you to meet tonight." They paused near the fireplace, where a small group was engaged in animated discussion about the latest discoveries in the field of natural history. At the center of the group stood a man who immediately commanded Evangeline's attention, not through physical imposing presence, but through the quiet intensity of his manner and the obvious respect with which the others listened to his words. Dr. Elias Reid was perhaps 35 years of age, with auburn hair that caught the lamplight and intelligent hazel eyes that seemed to take in everything around him with scientific precision. He was not conventionally handsome in the way that Alexander was. His features were more angular, his build leaner, but there was something compelling about his animated expression and the passionate way he gestured as he spoke about his research. "Dr. Reed," Agatha interrupted the conversation with practiced ease, "I would like you to meet my great-niece, the Duchess of Ravenshollow, Evangeline. This is Dr. Elias Reed, whose work I've been telling you about." Dr. Reed turned toward them, and Evangeline felt the full force of his attention as his eyes met hers. There was no deference in his gaze, no automatic acknowledgement of her title. Instead, she saw genuine curiosity and what appeared to be immediate interest. "Your Grace," he said, offering a bow that was respectful but not obsequious. "Lady Agatha has spoken of your botanical illustrations with such enthusiasm that I confess I've been quite eager to make your acquaintance." The pleasure is entirely mine, Dr. Reed," Evangeline replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "I've read your recent paper on plant classification with great interest. Your theories about the relationship between environmental factors and morphological adaptation are fascinating." A look of genuine surprise crossed his features, followed by something that might have been delight. "You've read my work? I must say that's refreshing. Most people of fashion find botanical research rather dry." "Perhaps they simply haven't had the right teacher," Evangeline suggested, feeling emboldened by his obvious interest in her opinion. "I've found that passion for a subject can make even the most complex theories accessible." "Spoken like a true scientist," Dr. Reed said with a smile that transformed his entire face. "Lady Agatha mentioned that you've been working on botanical illustrations. I don't suppose you brought any examples with you tonight?" Evangeline's heart raced with nervous excitement. "As a matter of fact, I did, though I should warn you that my work is that of an enthusiastic amateur rather than a trained professional." "In my experience," Dr. Reed replied, "enthusiasm often produces more accurate observations than formal training." "May I see your portfolio?" With trembling hands, Evangeline retrieved her leather portfolio from where Agatha had placed it on a nearby table. As she opened it to reveal her carefully mounted illustrations, she was acutely aware of Dr. Reed's intense scrutiny. The first image was a detailed study of a rare orchid she had cultivated in Ravenshollow's conservatory, showing not only the flower in full bloom, but also cross-sections of the reproductive organs and detailed studies of the root system. Dr. Reed's intake of breath was audible. "Good God," he murmured, leaning closer to examine the illustration. "This is extraordinary work. The level of detail, the accuracy of the anatomical structures. Where did you study?" "I'm entirely self-taught," Evangeline admitted, watching his face for signs of disappointment. "I've had access to an extensive botanical library and conservatory, but no formal instruction." "Self-taught?" Dr. Reed looked up at her with something approaching awe. "Your Grace, this work rivals anything being produced by the finest botanical artists in Europe. The precision of your observations, the delicacy of your technique, it's remarkable." As he continued to examine her illustrations, commenting on specific details and asking perceptive questions about her methods, Evangeline felt a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire crackling nearby. Here was someone who understood her passion, who could appreciate the countless hours she had spent perfecting her technique and studying her subjects. "This illustration of the Venus flytrap," Dr. Reed said, pausing at one of her more complex pieces, "shows a level of understanding of the plant's mechanisms that suggests you've conducted your own experiments." "I have," Evangeline confirmed, her confidence growing with each moment. "I was fascinated by the trigger mechanism and spent months observing and documenting the plant's responses to different stimuli." "Remarkable," Dr. Reed breathed. "Your Grace, I hope you won't think me presumptuous, but I believe your work deserves a much wider audience. Have you considered publication?" Before Evangeline could respond, a familiar voice cut through their conversation like a blade through silk. Well, if it isn't the runaway Duchess, playing at being a blue stocking." Evangeline's blood turned to ice as she turned to see Charlotte Ashworth approaching, resplendent in golden silk that matched her carefully arranged curls. Behind her, looking uncomfortable but determined, was Alexander himself, magnificent in formal evening wear that emphasized his commanding presence. The sight of her husband sent a shock through Evangeline's entire system. What was he doing in London? How had he found her? And why was Charlotte Ashworth with him? Miss Ashworth, Evangeline managed, her voice carefully controlled despite the turmoil in her chest. What an unexpected surprise. Charlotte's smile was as sharp as a blade. Oh, I'm Mrs. Ashworth now, actually. Or rather, I will be quite soon. Alexander and I have just announced our engagement. The words hit Evangeline like a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs and making the room spin around her. Engaged. But they were still married. How could Alexander be engaged to another woman? I'm afraid there's been some confusion, Dr. Reed interjected, his voice carrying a note of protective authority that surprised everyone present. The Duchess is still married to the Duke of Ravenshollow. Surely there's been some mistake. Alexander stepped forward, his storm-grey eyes fixed on Evangeline with an expression she couldn't read. There has been no mistake, Dr. Reed. My wife and I have agreed to seek an annulment of our marriage. The papers were filed this morning. An annulment? Evangeline's voice was barely a whisper. But we never discussed. We discussed it quite thoroughly on the morning of your departure, Alexander said coldly. You made it clear that you found our marriage intolerable. I have simply taken steps to remedy the situation. The lie was so blatant, so cruel, that Evangeline felt her knees threaten to buckle. She had never agreed to an annulment, had never even known such proceedings had been initiated. The conversation they'd had before her departure had been about her temporary absence, not the permanent dissolution of their marriage. Your Grace, Dr. Reed said quietly, moving closer to her side. Are you quite well? You've gone very pale. His concern, so genuine and immediate, provided the anchor she needed to steady herself. Drawing on reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed, Evangeline lifted her chin and met Alexander's gaze directly. I see, she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. How efficient of you, Your Grace, to arrange the dissolution of our marriage without bothering to inform me. I suppose I should be grateful that you finally decided to be honest about your feelings. Evangeline, Alexander began, but she cut him off with a gesture. No, she said firmly. You've made your position quite clear. You've chosen to end our marriage in favor of a union with Miss Ashworth, excuse me, your fiancée. I wish you both every happiness. Charlotte's triumphant smile faltered slightly at Evangeline's dignified response, clearly having expected tears or hysterics rather than composed acceptance. However, Evangeline continued, turning to address the assembled guests who had fallen silent to witness the dramatic confrontation, I find myself in the fortunate position of being free to pursue my own interests without the constraints of an unwanted marriage. Dr. Reed, you mentioned the possibility of publication for my botanical work. Dr. Reed, who had been watching the exchange with growing anger on Evangeline's behalf, immediately understood her strategy. Indeed I did, Your Grace. In fact, I would be honored to sponsor your work for presentation to the Royal Botanical Society. Your illustrations deserve recognition from the scientific community. The Royal Botanical Society? Alexander's voice carried a note of surprise that suggested he hadn't expected his discarded wife to have such prestigious connections. Dr. Reed is one of the Society's most respected members, Agatha interjected smoothly, moving to stand beside her great niece in a show of support. His endorsement carries considerable weight in academic circles. How fascinating, Charlotte said with false sweetness. I had no idea that flower painting was considered such serious work. Botanical illustration is a highly specialized scientific discipline, Dr. Reed replied, his voice carrying a sharp edge. It requires not only artistic skill, but also extensive knowledge of plant anatomy, physiology, and classification. The Duchess's work demonstrates mastery of all these areas. The respect in his voice, the way he defended her work and her abilities, sent a warm glow through Evangeline's chest. Here was a man who valued her mind, who saw her as more than a decorative ornament or a means to an end. "Dr. Reed," she said, making a decision that would change the course of her life, "I would be honored to accept your sponsorship. When might we begin the process of preparing my work for presentation?" "We could start immediately, if you're willing," he replied, his eyes bright with enthusiasm. "I have connections with several publishers who specialize in scientific texts. Your work could be in print within 6 months." The implications of his offer were staggering. Publication would mean recognition, independence, and most importantly, a future built on her own merits rather than her husband's title. It would also mean working closely with Dr. Reed, a prospect that filled her with anticipation rather than apprehension. "Then let us begin," she said, extending her hand to him with a smile that felt genuine for the first time in months. As Dr. Reed took her hand, his fingers warm and strong against hers, Evangeline caught sight of Alexander's expression. For just a moment, the careful mask slipped, and she saw something that looked remarkably like regret flash across his features. But it was too late for regrets. He had made his choice, and now she was free to make hers. "Excellent," Agatha declared, clapping her hands together. "This calls for champagne. We're witnessing the birth of a new scientific career." As the assembled guests raised their glasses in toast to Evangeline's future, she felt a sense of liberation she had never experienced before. The woman who had fled Yorkshire in shame and humiliation was gone, replaced by someone stronger, more confident, and infinitely more interesting. But as the evening progressed and she found herself drawn into increasingly animated conversations with Dr. Reed about their shared passion for botanical science, one question continued to haunt her thoughts. Why had Alexander really chosen to end their marriage? And what secrets was he still hiding behind his carefully constructed facade? The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Lady Agatha's breakfast room, casting golden patterns across the mahogany table where Evangeline sat reading the morning papers with a mixture of fascination and trepidation. 3 weeks had passed since the dramatic confrontation at the Salon, and London society had embraced the scandal with the voracious appetite of a starving beast. The headlines ranged from the merely sensational to the utterly fabricated, but all carried the same basic narrative. The Duke of Ravenshollow had cast aside his provincial wife in favour of the dazzling Charlotte Ashworth. "The Botanical Duchess, from disgrace to discovery," Evangeline read aloud from the Times, her voice carrying a note of wry amusement. "I must say, they've made me sound far more dramatic than I feel." Agatha looked up from her own correspondence with a knowing smile. "My dear, you've become the most talked-about woman in London. Half the ton is scandalized by your husband's behavior, while the other half is fascinated by your transformation into a woman of science. Either way, you're the center of attention. Indeed, the past weeks had brought a whirlwind of activity that had left Evangeline's head spinning. Dr. Reed had proven to be as good as his word, introducing her to a network of publishers, scientists, and intellectuals who had received her work with genuine enthusiasm. Her botanical illustrations were already being prepared for publication in a prestigious scientific journal, and there was talk of a comprehensive volume that would establish her as a serious contributor to the field. More importantly, she had discovered a sense of purpose and fulfillment that had been entirely absent from her life at Ravenshollow. Working alongside Dr. Reed, Elias, as he had insisted she call him, had opened her eyes to possibilities she had never imagined. Their collaboration had evolved from professional respect into something deeper and more complex, though both had been careful to maintain appropriate boundaries given her still uncertain marital status. "Speaking of attention," Agatha continued, "you have a visitor waiting in the drawing room. A rather persistent young gentleman who claims to have urgent business with you." Evangeline's heart skipped a beat. Alexander? No, my dear. Someone far more pleasant, I assure you. Doctor, Reed has been waiting for nearly an hour, though he seems quite content to examine my collection of pressed flowers while he waits. The mention of Elias's name brought a warmth to Evangeline's cheeks that she hoped Agatha wouldn't notice. Their relationship had grown increasingly intimate over the past weeks, though they had been scrupulously careful to maintain propriety. Still, she couldn't deny the growing attraction she felt toward the brilliant, passionate man who had shown her a world beyond the suffocating constraints of aristocratic society. "I should see what he needs," Evangeline said, rising from the table with perhaps more haste than was strictly necessary. She found Elias in the drawing-room, standing before one of Agatha's botanical displays with the intense concentration that characterized all his scientific observations. He was dressed in his usual practical attire, a well-tailored but unpretentious brown coat and cream waistcoat that emphasized his lean frame and scholarly demeanor. When he turned at her entrance, his face lit up with the warm smile that never failed to make her pulse quicken. "Evangeline," he said, moving toward her with obvious pleasure, "I hope you'll forgive the early hour, but I have news that couldn't wait." "Of course," she replied, gesturing for him to take a seat on the comfortable sofa near the fireplace. "You look quite excited about something." "I am indeed," Elias said, settling beside her with barely contained enthusiasm. "I've just come from a meeting with the Royal Botanical Society's publication committee. They've not only accepted your illustrations for the Spring Journal, but they've also commissioned you to create a complete series documenting the rare orchids in the Kew Gardens collection." Evangeline's breath caught in her throat. The Royal Botanical Society was the most prestigious scientific organization in England, and to be commissioned by them was an honor beyond her wildest dreams. "Are you quite serious?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Entirely serious," Elias confirmed, reaching into his coat to withdraw an official-looking document. "The commission comes with a substantial fee, enough to ensure your financial independence regardless of the outcome of your annulment proceedings. More importantly, it establishes you as a recognized scientific illustrator in your own right." The implications of his words were staggering. Financial independence meant freedom from the constraints of her marriage, from the need to rely on Alexander's support or her family's charity. It meant the ability to make her own choices, to live her own life according to her own values and desires. "Elias," she said, her eyes filling with tears of gratitude and joy, "I don't know how to thank you. Without your support, your belief in my abilities, you would have found your way eventually," he interrupted gently. "Talent like yours cannot be hidden forever. I simply had the privilege of helping to bring it to light." As they sat together in the warm morning sunlight, Evangeline became acutely aware of the charged atmosphere between them. Elias's hand rested on the sofa cushion mere inches from her own, and she could see the pulse beating at the base of his throat. The careful distance they had maintained was becoming increasingly difficult to sustain, especially as her legal separation from Alexander moved toward its inevitable conclusion. "There's something else," Elias said, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "Something I need to discuss with you before we proceed any further with our professional collaboration." Evangeline's heart began to race, sensing that whatever he was about to say would change everything between them. "I've received an offer from the University of Edinburgh," he continued, his eyes never leaving her face. "They've invited me to establish a new department of botanical research, with full autonomy to pursue my own studies and to hire my own staff." "That's wonderful," Evangeline said, though she felt a stab of disappointment at the thought of his leaving London. "It's exactly the kind of opportunity you deserve." "It is," Elias agreed, "but I find myself reluctant to accept unless I know that you would consider joining me there, not just as a colleague, Evangeline, but as something more." The words hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that made Evangeline's pulse race. She had known that their relationship was moving beyond mere professional collaboration, but to hear him speak so openly about a future together was both thrilling and terrifying. "Elias," she began, but he held up a hand to stop her. "I know that your situation is complicated," he said quickly. "I know that you're still legally married, that there are social conventions to consider, that my position in society is far below your own. But I also know that what we've found together is rare and precious, and I would be a fool to let it slip away without at least declaring my intentions." Evangeline felt her heart swell with emotion. Here was a man who valued her mind, who respected her abilities, who saw her as an equal partner rather than a decorative accessory. The contrast with her marriage to Alexander could not have been more stark. "Your position in society means nothing to me," she said firmly. "You are one of the most brilliant men I've ever known, and your work will outlast the petty concerns of aristocratic bloodlines. As for my legal situation, the annulment should be finalized within the month." "Then you would consider it?" Elias asked, hope evident in his voice. "A life in Edinburgh, working together, building something meaningful." Before Evangeline could respond, the drawing-room door burst open to admit a figure that made her blood run cold. Alexander stood in the doorway, his face a mask of barely controlled fury, his storm-grey eyes fixed on the intimate scene before him with an intensity that was almost frightening. "How touching," he said, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. The runaway duchess and her scholarly paramour, planning their romantic escape. Elias rose immediately, placing himself protectively between Evangeline and her estranged husband. "Your Grace," he said with icy politeness, "I wasn't aware that you were expected." "I wasn't," Alexander replied, stepping into the room with the predatory grace of a hunting cat. "But when one's wife is conducting her affairs so publicly, one feels compelled to intervene." "Our marriage is over, Alexander," Evangeline said, rising to stand beside Elias. "You made that abundantly clear when you announced your engagement to Charlotte. You have no right to interfere in my life now." "On the contrary," Alexander said, producing a folded document from his coat. "I have every right. The annulment proceedings have been suspended pending further investigation into the circumstances of our marriage." Evangeline felt the blood drain from her face. "Suspended? On what grounds?" "It seems," Alexander continued with cold satisfaction, "that certain irregularities have come to light regarding the original marriage contract. Questions have been raised about the validity of your father's consent, given his compromised mental state at the time of the negotiations. The implication was clear and devastating. If the marriage contract was deemed invalid due to her father's gambling-induced desperation, the annulment would be unnecessary. Their marriage would be declared void from the beginning, leaving Evangeline with no legal protections and no claim to any settlement." "You bastard," Elias said quietly, his scholarly demeanor replaced by something far more dangerous. "You're trying to destroy her reputation and her financial security out of pure spite." "I'm trying to protect my family's honor," Alexander replied coldly. "My wife seems to have forgotten her duties and her position. Perhaps a reminder is in order." "I'm not your wife in any meaningful sense," Evangeline said, her voice shaking with anger. "You made that clear when you publicly humiliated me and announced your engagement to another woman. Whatever game you're playing now, I won't be a pawn in it." Alexander's expression softened slightly, and for a moment she thought she saw something that might have been regret in his eyes. "Evangeline, if you would just listen—" "No," she interrupted firmly. "I've listened to your lies and your half-truths for 3 years. I won't make that mistake again." She turned to Elias, her decision crystallizing with sudden clarity. "Yes," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Yes, I will come to Edinburgh with you. Whatever legal complications Alexander creates, whatever social scandal follows, I choose to build a life with someone who values me for who I am rather than what I represent." Elias's face lit up with joy. and he took her hands in his own, heedless of Alexander's presence. "Are you certain? The path won't be easy." "I'm certain," Evangeline said firmly. "I've spent too many years living according to other people's expectations. It's time I started living for myself." Alexander's face had gone pale, and she thought she saw his hands tremble slightly as he folded the legal document. "You don't understand what you're doing," he said quietly. "There are things you don't know, circumstances that—" "Then tell me," Evangeline challenged. "Stop hiding behind your mysterious circumstances and your half-explanations. If there's something I need to know, then have the courage to say it plainly." For a moment, Alexander seemed on the verge of speaking, his mouth opening as if to reveal whatever secrets he had been guarding so carefully. But then his expression hardened again, and he shook his head. "Some truths are too dangerous to speak," he said finally. "You'll have to trust that everything I've done has been to protect you." "Protect me?" Evangeline's voice rose with incredulous anger. "You've humiliated me, abandoned me, and now you're trying to destroy my chance at happiness. If that's your idea of protection, then I want nothing to do with it." Alexander stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he bowed formally, the gesture carrying a finality that made her chest tighten with unexpected emotion. "Very well," he said quietly. "I can see that your mind is made up. I hope you find the happiness you're seeking, Evangeline. I truly do." As he turned to leave, Evangeline felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to call him back, to demand the explanations he seemed so reluctant to give. But pride and hurt held her tongue, and she watched in silence as he walked out of her life for what she believed would be the final time. "Are you all right?" Elias asked gently, his hand warm and comforting on her shoulder. "I will be," Evangeline replied, though her voice carried a note of uncertainty. "I just need time to process everything that's happened." As they stood together in the aftermath of Alexander's visit, Evangeline tried to focus on the bright future that lay ahead, the work she loved, the man who valued her, the independence she had fought so hard to achieve. But despite her best efforts, she couldn't shake the feeling that Alexander's mysterious warnings carried more weight than she wanted to admit. What secrets was he still hiding, and why did he seem so desperate to protect her from them? 6 months later, the crisp autumn air of Edinburgh carried the scent of burning leaves and the promise of winter as Evangeline stood at the window of her new studio, watching the golden light play across the ancient stones of the university buildings. The view from her third-floor workspace in the newly established Department of Botanical Research was breathtaking. Rolling hills dotted with the changing colours of Scottish maples and oaks, the distant spires of Edinburgh Castle rising majestically against the cloudy sky, and below, the bustling courtyard where students and professors moved with the purposeful energy of academic pursuit. Her studio was a sanctuary of organized creativity, filled with the tools of her trade and the fruits of her labor. Easels held works in various stages of completion, while carefully labeled specimens lined the shelves in glass containers and pressed between sheets of archival paper. The commission from the Royal Botanical Society had been completed to universal acclaim, leading to additional projects that had established her reputation as one of Britain's foremost botanical illustrators. Her work now graced the pages of scientific journals across Europe, and her comprehensive volume on Scottish Highland flora was scheduled for publication in the spring. But it was not professional success alone that had transformed Evangeline from the broken woman who had fled Yorkshire into the confident, radiant person she had become. The true source of her happiness stood across the room, bent over a microscope with the intense concentration that characterized all his scientific endeavors. Dr. Elias Reid, now Professor Reid, head of the university's botanical department, had proven to be everything she had hoped for and more. Their professional partnership had blossomed into a personal relationship of remarkable depth and compatibility. He challenged her intellectually, supported her ambitions, and treated her as an equal partner in all their endeavors. More importantly, he had shown her what it meant to be truly loved for who she was, rather than what she represented. "The cellular structure of this specimen is extraordinary," Elias murmured, adjusting the microscope's focus with delicate precision. "The adaptation to the highland climate has produced modifications I've never seen before." Evangeline smiled at his enthusiasm, setting down her brush to move closer to his workstation. Even after months of working together, his passion for discovery never failed to inspire her own curiosity. "May I see?" she asked, and he immediately stepped aside to allow her access to the microscope. The intimate gesture, his hand briefly touching her waist as she leaned over the instrument, the warmth of his body close behind her, sent a familiar thrill through her system. Their relationship had progressed with careful consideration for propriety, but the attraction between them was undeniable and growing stronger with each passing day. "You're right," she said, studying the magnified plant tissue. "The cell walls are remarkably thick, and the arrangement suggests an unusual method of water retention. This could be significant for understanding how highland species survive the harsh winters." "Exactly what I was thinking," Elias said, his voice warm with approval. "Your eye for detail continues to amaze me, Evangeline. You see things that trained botanists often miss." The compliment, delivered with such genuine admiration, made her heart flutter with pleasure. How different this was from her marriage to Alexander, where her interests had been tolerated rather than celebrated, where her intelligence had been acknowledged but never truly valued. A soft knock at the studio door interrupted their work, and Evangeline's assistant, Miss Margaret Campbell, entered with a tea tray and a small stack of correspondence. "Begging your pardon, Professor Reed, Mrs. Blackwood," Margaret said, using the name Evangeline had adopted for her professional work. "I've brought your afternoon tea, and there are several letters that require your attention." Margaret was a bright young woman from a respectable Edinburgh family, one of the first female students to be admitted to the university's botanical program. Her presence in the department had caused considerable controversy among the more traditional faculty members, but Elias had insisted that talent should be recognized regardless of gender, a position that had only increased Evangeline's admiration for him. "Thank you, Margaret," Evangeline said, accepting the correspondence with a grateful smile. "How are your own studies progressing?" "Very well, ma'am," Margaret replied with obvious enthusiasm. "Professor Reed has assigned me to assist with the classification of the new specimens from the Hebrides expedition. It's fascinating work." As Margaret departed, Evangeline sorted through the letters, noting correspondence from publishers, fellow scientists, and various academic institutions, but one envelope bearing the familiar seal of Ravenshollow Manor made her hands tremble slightly. "What is it?" Elias asked, immediately noticing her change in demeanor. "A letter from Yorkshire," Evangeline replied, her voice carefully controlled. "From Alexander." It was the first direct communication she had received from her estranged husband since their confrontation in London. The legal proceedings regarding their marriage had been resolved in her favor. The annulment had been granted, despite Alexander's initial objections, leaving her free to pursue her new life. She had heard through mutual acquaintances that his engagement to Charlotte Ashworth had ended abruptly, though the reasons remained mysterious. "Do you want to read it?" Elias asked gently, his concern evident in his voice. Evangeline hesitated, then broke the seal with decisive movements. Whatever Alexander had to say, she was strong enough now to face it without fear. The letter was written in Alexander's familiar, bold hand, but the tone was unlike anything she had ever received from him. "My dearest Evangeline, I hope this letter finds you well and thriving in your new life. I have followed your professional success with great pride and admiration, though I confess that reading about your achievements in the scientific journals brings both joy and profound regret. I write to you now, not as your former husband, but as someone who owes you the truth that I was too cowardly to speak when we were together. The circumstances that governed my behavior during our marriage were not what they appeared, and I fear that my attempts to protect you only caused you greater pain. The truth is that our marriage was arranged not merely for financial reasons, but as part of a complex web of political intrigue that I only fully understood after our wedding. Your father's debts were not the result of gambling, as we were led to believe, but rather the consequence of his involvement in certain sensitive government matters. The marriage contract contained provisions that would have placed you in considerable danger had our union been consummated. I maintained distance from you not out of indifference, but because I had been warned that your safety depended upon the appearance of an unconsummated marriage. There were those who would have used our relationship against both of us, and I believed that keeping you at arm's length was the only way to protect you from forces beyond our control. The events of Christmas Eve were orchestrated by Charlotte Ashworth, who was working on behalf of certain political interests that sought to destabilize my position and, through me, access to sensitive information about government operations. My public rejection of you was intended to convince these forces that you held no value as leverage against me. I know that this explanation comes far too late to repair the damage I have caused, and I do not write seeking forgiveness or reconciliation. I simply wanted you to know that every moment of distance between us was a sacrifice I made for your protection, not a reflection of my true feelings. You deserved so much better than the cold, distant husband I felt compelled to be. I'm grateful that you have found happiness and fulfillment with someone who can give you the love and respect you have always deserved. I wish you every joy in your new life, my dear Evangeline. You have bloomed magnificently in the soil of your own choosing. With deepest respect and enduring affection, Alexander P.S. I have taken the liberty of establishing a trust fund in your name, drawn from my personal holdings rather than the Ravens Hollow estate. You may access these funds at any time through the Bank of Scotland in Edinburgh. Consider it a small compensation for the years of happiness I denied you through my deception. Evangeline read the letter twice, her emotions swirling between anger, sadness, and a strange sense of relief. The mysterious circumstances that had governed Alexander's behavior finally made sense, though the revelation came far too late to change anything between them. "What does he say?" Elias asked quietly, respecting her need to process the information privately. "He explains everything," Evangeline replied, her voice thick with emotion. The distance, the coldness, the public humiliation. It was all an elaborate deception designed to protect me from political enemies who would have used our relationship against him. Elias was quiet for a long moment, absorbing the implications of her words. "Do you believe him?" "I do," Evangeline said slowly. "It explains so many things that never made sense. His behavior, the timing of certain events, even Charlotte's involvement. But it doesn't change anything, Elias. Even if his motives were noble, he chose deception over trust. He never gave me the chance to face the danger alongside him, or to make my own choices about the risks I was willing to take." "And now?" Elias asked, his voice carefully neutral despite the obvious concern in his eyes. Evangeline folded the letter carefully and set it aside, then moved to stand before the window overlooking the university grounds. Below, students hurried across the courtyard with books tucked under their arms, their faces bright with the enthusiasm of learning. This was her world now, a place where knowledge was valued, where her contributions mattered, where she was free to be herself without pretense or deception. "Now I continue building the life I've chosen," she said firmly, turning back to face the man who had shown her what true partnership could be. "Alexander's revelations don't change the fact that our marriage was built on lies and maintained through deception. What we have, Elias, is built on honesty, mutual respect, and genuine affection." Relief flooded Elias's features, and he moved to take her hands in his own. I was afraid that learning the truth about his motives might change your feelings about our future together. Never, Evangeline said with conviction. You've shown me what it means to be valued for my mind, respected for my abilities, and loved for who I truly am. That's not something I would ever willingly give up. As if summoned by her words, Margaret appeared in the doorway again, this time carrying a small velvet box that made Evangeline's heart skip a beat. Professor Reed, Margaret said with barely contained excitement, the jeweler's apprentice just delivered this package for you. Elias accepted the box with hands that trembled slightly, then turned to face Evangeline with an expression of nervous determination. I had planned to wait until this evening, he said, his voice thick with emotion, but after reading that letter, I find I can't delay any longer. He dropped to one knee before her, opening the box to reveal a simple but elegant ring, set with a deep green emerald surrounded by small diamonds. Evangeline, he said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment, you have transformed my life in ways I never thought possible. You've shown me that love and intellectual partnership can coexist, that two minds working together can achieve more than either could alone. Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Tears of joy spilled down Evangeline's cheeks as she looked down at the man who had given her back her sense of worth and purpose. The ring was beautiful, but more importantly, it represented a future built on equality, honesty, and mutual devotion. Yes, she whispered, then louder, yes, Elias, with all my heart. As he slipped the ring onto her finger and rose to take her in his arms, Evangeline felt the last shadows of her past finally lifting. She had indeed bloomed where she was planted, but more than that, she had chosen her own soil, tended her own garden, and found love that nourished rather than constrained her growth. The woman who had once been the neglected Duchess of Ravenshollow was gone forever, replaced by someone stronger, wiser, and infinitely more fulfilled. As Elias's lips met hers in a kiss that promised a lifetime of shared discoveries and mutual devotion, Evangeline knew that she had finally found her true home, not in a grand estate or ancient title, but in the arms of a man who loved her for exactly who she was meant to be. Outside the window, the Scottish autumn painted the world in shades of gold and crimson, a fitting backdrop for the beginning of a love story that would endure long after the last leaves had fallen. And in the distance, barely visible through the afternoon mist, Edinburgh Castle stood as a silent witness to the triumph of a woman who had dared to choose her own destiny. If you've been captivated by Evangeline's journey from heartbreak to triumph, from the gilded cage of an arranged marriage to the freedom of true love and professional success, then you understand the power of choosing your own path. Her story reminds us that sometimes the greatest betrayals can lead to the most beautiful transformations, and that real love honors who we are rather than who we're expected to be. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories of courage, transformation, and the triumph of the human spirit. Share this tale with someone who needs to be reminded that it's never too late to bloom where you choose to plant yourself. And tell us in the comments, what would you have done in Evangeline's place? Would you have forgiven Alexander's deception or chosen the honest love that Elias offered? Until our next story, remember that you have the power to write your own ending.